Perfect. All right, welcome to the Austin Women's Investing Group. We are a dynamic and diverse group of women who enjoy learning and sharing investing ideas in a fun and comfortable group setting. I'm Sara, investor, advisor, and founder of Black Barn Financial and the Austin Women's Investing Group. My friend Michelle and I started Austin Women's Investing Group way back in 2011 as a way to get a bunch of women in a room to talk about money and investing and finance. And now it's 10 years later. We just had our 10-year anniversary in March. We have over 2,600 members on the meetup group and I think over 1,000 women in our private Facebook group. So if you came in either through the Facebook group or the meetup group and you're not a member of both, I encourage you to kind of sign up in both spots because it's just the way to get the most amount of information on what we're doing as a group. We definitely benefit from investors with various levels of experience. And so I just want to say this right off the bat that investors are especially encouraged to join the group and participate in the group because that's what the whole group is for. Sometimes I try to recruit people to the group and women will say, well, like, I don't know anything about investing. So that's what the group is for. It's for people with all levels of experience. This is the place where you can come to ask questions. And it's also a place where you can come to share your experience with your fellow members. That's where a lot of the learning happens. So as Laurie's going through her discussion, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box or unmute yourself in this case. And if you see a question or hear a question where you have some experience, please share it with the group. That's, again, like it's what the group is for. We're here to learn from each other. Gwen and I will be reviewing the questions in the chat box and we'll stop Laurie periodically as she's going through to give her a chance to answer questions that pop up or to open up the question to the whole group. Our topic today is on paying for college, led by Laurie Watts. Laurie's a longtime AWIG member and she's one of the co-organizers of our group. She's led several of our meetings over the years and she always brings this amazing like common sense perspective to every topic she discusses. So I'm really excited that she's leading this topic in particular. Laurie, thank you for volunteering to share your experience and for showing up to lead the group this month. But before I turn it over to Laurie, I just want to take a moment to be very clear that nothing in this meeting is intended to be investment advice. We're here to share our knowledge and experience, but if you need advice, you should enter into a formal relationship with a financial advisor first. Everything here is opinions and you should always do your own due diligence before opening any accounts or investing in anything. Okay, I think that's most of what I was hoping to say before the meeting. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Laurie.
Hi. So I am going over this topic mainly because it's something I wanted to learn more about and didn't really know anything about. And looking forward to what to do about my current 10-year-old when he goes into school 8 years from now. So that's why I decided to teach this particular course. Something about me, I'm a software developer. I've been in Austin probably 30 years and really like looking at finance stuff, mainly because my dad was interested in that and I kind of picked it up from him. I also like looking at real estate and talking about real estate issues. I have 2 rental properties right now. So when I first started looking at this, I was actually pretty depressed because it's a huge topic. There is a lot of stuff to think about. Not only is it, you know, saving, how to save, how much to save, then there's the whole dilemma of how do you know which school to go to? You know, should you try for one of the Ivy League schools versus one of the public schools? Is it really going to make a difference in the end? How do you determine if it's a good fit? So since there's just so many things to talk about, I decided to narrow this discussion down to basically the starting point when you're way away from your kid going to college and you know that you probably should start saving. So we're just going to look at that this time. Basically, should you save? How would you go about doing that? How much should you save? That type of thing. And I have a couple of resources at the end for you to look at and try and get more information. but like I said, it's a big topic and everyone has different opinions on different things. So maybe at the end we'll have time for some discussion and just general information about it, because it seems like a lot of this information is passed anecdotally, and that's partly because it's not static, it's changing all the time. The price of the college, how much the college is giving out in aid, what they're looking for in that particular freshman class for that year, it just is not static at all. Never mind that, you know, the kids are all different, the schools are all different. What might be right for one person is not going to work for another, and what might be right for one family might not work for another. So feel free to bring in some information if you had some. So we're going to start by talking about, if I can figure out how to go to next. How much is it these days? There. So I just went to this website that seemed to have fairly good information, and private colleges are around 37,000 on average, and the public colleges around 10,000, with out-of-state paying around 27,000. So just for grins, I went to another website and I tried to dig out information on UT versus Rice, because I thought those would be some good comparisons. And also because UT's here and I went to Rice. Yay! So tuition and fees, according to this one website, was around 11,000 in-state and 40,000 out-of-state. Rice was around 51,000. So when you add in books and living costs, it's right around 24,000 and 66,000. So if we go look back at these averages, it's probably closer to here. These are tuitions and fees, so these don't include all of the other ones, but they're fairly close with what they consider to be the average. So I think these are fairly realistic numbers. So for 4 years, that's close to 100,000 for UT and 267,000 for Rice, which is a lot. But how much is it going to be in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or 5 years? So you can assume that it's going to increase every 5 years, just because it's been doing that over the past several decades. So if we look at that, UT is going to be around 39,000 and Rice is going to be 108,000. Them giving us 159,000 for 4 years and 465 for 4 years. And that's almost laughable. I just look at that number and that just seems unrealistic. And so it's like, you wonder, am I really supposed to have that as a goal? How realistic is that? Well, apparently there's some wiggle room there. Just like you would go to a car dealership and you buy a car, you don't pay sticker price. Usually you can get either financial aid, need-based aid, or what they're calling merit aid, which is basically merit aid, sort of like the discount that the car dealer gives you when you walk in and you look like you're going to be a hard sell. And maybe they want to throw a little bit of money at you. And so they discount their price a little bit. So here's that same website comparing what their sticker price is for private. So Rice was at 51,000, so 54,000, that's pretty close. They ended up paying 26,000. So that's a huge reduction. What am I doing? 54,000 through 33,000, which is still a huge reduction. And this 26,000 went down to 19,000. And you can see that this is that huge reduction. You got a bigger reduction with the private schools, probably more like the Ivy League schools versus the public colleges, probably because their sticker price is just so much higher to begin with. So you can't really save based on what the sticker price is going to be. or the average net price, because you really don't know what it's going to be. You can only come up with like a guesstimate. Partly because the average net price depends on how much aid you get and the makeup of their freshman class and who they're trying to get in versus, who they think is a shoe-in. So should you even bother saving for this? I mean, it looks like an unattainable goal. People are saving for houses, and that's like a huge thing. Should you even bother to put this on your plate? Because you also have retirement savings. I think the answer is yes, because it kind of goes back to the philosophy that we have of even a little bit is something. And if you start small at the beginning and let it start growing, you'll get the compounding, and it will be something at the end. It might not be, that huge 435,000 amount, but it will be something. And it's tax free if you use it for tuition, fees, books and supplies, even room and board in some cases. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, about what you can use it for. But I think you want to start now, even if you haven't started, and just put a little bit in there. You could, put a little bit in your retirement fund, a little bit in your college fund. If you have your house fund, put a little bit in there. It doesn't help to earmark a little bit to go into the college fund. So also, according to this book I read, which was written by a journalist, so a lot of it's opinion based, but he thinks that the people who are admitting in the administration office, admitting people, that if they see you don't have a 529 fund at all, they're going to think you're really not serious. Some people don't want to start a 529 because then they think the financial aid office is going to say, look, they have all this money. I really think they could pay for it. We don't have to give them that much. But it won't reduce your financial aid that much. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around on my slide. So yes, I think it's good to start it to make sure it looks like you're serious. Even if your kid doesn't go to college, it can be used for other schools or some other type of training, or even given to someone else. Even if you believe that your kids should pay for it all themselves, you're probably going to help out in some way when they go to school, even if it's only buying the books for them or helping pay their rent. You're probably going to do that. So why not start a 529, because it can grow tax-free? And this is the topic that I kind of jumped ahead to. If it's a parent-owned asset, there is a law that says it will only reduce your need-based financial aid by 5.64%. It's reduced more if it's owned by a student or a grandparent. Sorry, I'm not very good at moving to the next one.
Hey, Laurie, do you want to stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions so far?
Yeah, that would be a great place to stop, because I know this is a topic that people have lots of different opinions on. So if anybody has different opinions, I'd like to hear them.
I had never heard that idea of the college admissions people seeing the lack of a 529 potentially as somewhat of a red flag, maybe not the biggest red flag that they would see, but that had not occurred to me until you said that. So
the man who wrote the book, he said, maybe it's a case of humans being humans.
yeah.
And you look at it and some part of you thinks, yeah, right, you didn't even start a 529. And he tried to get some of them to admit that that was true, but of course nobody would.
So no one admitted to it, yeah.
Nobody admitted to it, but he thought it probably was true, at least in some part. And it kind of does make sense that if you were thinking your kid was going to go to college all along, why didn't you go ahead and start a fund?
Yeah.
Even if you can show based on, because you're going to have to, show your income. They'll be able to see how much money you have. So they'll be able to see if it's reasonable that it didn't grow very much. But it might be just starting one, even if you put a little bit in it, is enough to convince them that they want you at their school. Because from what I can understand, it sounds like a big game. All of it's a big game getting into college. And a lot of it is convincing the college that they want, my kid, but also the college is trying to woo you to their school. And they don't want you to go to one of their competitors. So it really pays to shop around. And it sounds like it pays to apply at multiple different schools, even if it looks like you might not be able to afford it. Because I guess if your child looks good enough on paper, or they happen to fill the niche that they're looking for that year, they might try and woo your child to their school by giving more merit aid. So that's another reason I got depressed. It's like, oh my gosh, that sounds like junior and senior year of my kids' high school are going to be miserable. Because you really don't have an idea which one is going to be the right one. You do need to go and visit them. They said you can't just look at everything on paper. You have to go and see what the vibe is at the school, and see if that is really where your kid would like to go. So you can only, well, it depends, Lakeisha. So Lakeisha's asking, should you open one for each kid or just one for the family? And so you have a 529 fund, and only one kid, one person can be a beneficiary of that. So you can change the beneficiary. So if it works out that your other kid is going to be starting after the first kid has already left, then yes, you could just make them the beneficiary. But there's also limits to how much you can put in the 529. And the limits are around, I don't know, Sarah, if you remember, but I think they can be as much as 350,000, something like that. So it probably is easier just to make one for each kid. Because remember, you can always, if kid number 2 decides they don't want to go to school, you can still make kid number 1 the beneficiary of that 529. The other thing that he mentioned is that if you have 2 kids and they happen to be at school at the same time, that the colleges tend to give you more financial aid for that, because you have that hardship of 2 kids going to school at the same time. So even those things that you wouldn't think would come into play at all might come into play while you're figuring all of this out. Does that answer your question, Lakeisha? Cool.
And I'll also add in there kind of a morbid part of the answer, which is like, it may be, your intention, if you have one 529, to use it for all of the kids. But if something happens to you and you die and someone else takes over ownership of the account, they might not know or carry out your wishes for this one 529 plan to be used for all of the kids in the way that you envision. And so that's, I think most of us probably expect that that's a very small risk, but still we create wills and trusts and, directives to give people guidance, in a worst case scenario. And I think like the 529 issue is, it would be kind of similar as like estate planning concepts. And Sandy asked if we're going to talk about more details on 529s, and the answer is definitely yes.
Yes, so we're going to talk a lot about them. You guys are going to be tired of them. Okay, so here's some 529 plans that you can look at Texas, because your first thought is immediately, where are these things? I have to find one. So Texas has one of its own. You just go to this website and you can sign your kid up, and you have to give information. They also have one, this is a Texas plan too, which you can only get through a financial advisor. And I was reading about the Texas college plan. On one review, it got like 3.5 out of 5. And they said you could use it for other schools outside of Texas, which is usually what I've heard. Like, you don't really want one state specific usually, but this one, it said you could. But you don't have to use those Texas plans. And actually, they don't seem to be the best plans to use. So you use what's called an out-of-state plan, and that just basically means you're going to get a generic 529 from our friendly financial companies like Vanguard and T. Rowe Price. And you basically treat it like you treat, like, you know, here's all the rules that we always talk about. You have to compare performances. You have to find out what their fee ratio is. Do they have a minimum balance? Basically, I noticed that Texas College Savings Plan had a minimum of $25. So these probably have similar minimums. So Morningstar is one place that goes and compares them. And there's also another website that I list in the resources, savingforcollege.com. And I listed Vanguard and T. Rowe Price because those seem to be pretty highly rated on their website. I have one in Fidelity just because my dad opened one at Fidelity, and then I inherited it when he died, and I kept the beneficiary the same. It's still my son.
I have my kids' plans at Vanguard, just for what it's worth.
Okay. All right, so Sarah, maybe we should talk more about this and savings, because I'm about to go kind of heavily into the 529 and what it is and what can be included. I think now might be a good time to talk about that spreadsheet you showed me, where we basically talk about, let's assume we're going to have this much, and I already have this much in savings, and how do I reach my goal? Does that sound okay?
Yeah, great. I'm happy to share that. So again, like, this is, I think, where we're going. It sounds like where Laurie is going is into more details into the 529 specifically. So I think this is, I'll share this spreadsheet that I've put together in the past, just to kind of show you from a very high level perspective, how can one make the decision about how much to save, and then the roadmap to getting there, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about time value of money for all of you who are super excited to see that topic. Caitlin is loving it. That's her favorite topic of all time. So I will pull up my spreadsheet here as soon as I figure out how to share my screen with you all. Here we go. And this is just a simple Excel spreadsheet. I'm happy to share it with you. It's very simple, but I think it offers a lot of insight. So here at the very top, we're gonna, there's the inputs that Laurie already touched on, right? Because the first thing to think about if you are planning for college for someone else is, how much is it going to cost? And then the next question is, well, how much should I be on the hook for, right? Like, which is a very nuanced question, but we'll start here with how much is it going to cost? Luckily, my numbers are pretty close to what Laurie has in her PowerPoint presentation, right? When I'm talking to people in my professional life as a financial advisor, I'm usually talking to people who are in Austin, so we almost always start with, like, how much does it cost at UT, like Laurie said, right? So I usually put a nice round number of about $26,000 per year at UT, assuming that the kid is not living with you in Austin, right? That they're living somewhere else. So that's probably a pretty good estimate. The next thing, and probably the scariest part of these estimates, is the rate at which tuition goes up, right? Because if we look at inflation as a whole, it's pretty tame, right? Like in our whole, if we look at inflation in our whole life, but in the past, and this is probably the case going forward, inflation in educational expenses and healthcare tend to go up at higher than the average rate of inflation, if that makes sense. So, Laurie already did the calculation, and if you go to someplace like Schwab assumes that tuition increases at an average rate of 5% per year. I usually put in 6% per year. I mean, we're all guessing at this point, so, pick whatever the number is. I have 6% in here. That makes the estimates a little bit more conservative. The next input, okay, so to go back to time value of money, annual cost in 2021, this is your present value. Inflation of college expenses, in this calculation, this is your rate of return. Years until college, so how old is your kid, right? So we'll go for Sam, with Laurie's son, is 10. So that gives us basically 8 years to get to when he starts school. So we have 8 is our number of periods, or our N, in our time value of money calculations. And now we have enough money because we don't have a payment component of this one. Now we have enough information to calculate future value. So in Excel, we use our financial functions to calculate, okay, what will the price be in 8 years if the rate of inflation on UT expenses goes up by 6% per year? And the answer is $41,440. Like Laurie mentioned, okay, if we use 5%, which is Schwab's estimate, we're at 38. If we split the difference and say 5.5, we're at 39. Pick a number, right? But we're just trying to get an estimate of what we're shooting for.
Oh, Sara?
Yeah.
Can you increase the zoom on your spreadsheet so it's a little bit bigger?
Oh man, that is a good question. I know that there's a way for me to do that with my.
Try like Control Plus. Control Plus, I think.
That work? No. Can I just zoom in here? Sorry, I have a lot going on in my windows. Zoom. Oh, sorry. Zoom. 200.
Bottom right corner, Sandy says. Oh, you found it.
Oh, hey, thanks, Sandy. There we go. Oh, yes, Sandy, thank you. Okay. All right, so now we're at like 175. Is that better for everybody? So now we're kind of assuming that UT is going to be at about $40,000-ish per year in 4 years, assuming that Sam goes to school for only 4 years, right? That's about 160. So that becomes kind of our future value target. How much might we want to have saved in 8 years, right? So let's just kind of start with the assumption that Laurie wants to have this 529 fully funded for 4 years. So her target is basically 160. Now we come down here and run the calculation. How much does Laurie need to save each year in order to reach this goal? So we start with the present value of her existing 529. And let's say it's, I don't know, let's say it's $35,000. I'm just making up numbers, Laurie. We know that she has 8 years to meet this goal. Now we have to figure out what's the rate of return we can expect on this 529, right? This is really, really difficult. If you've ever heard me talk about time value of money calculations, your rate of return is exactly related to the types of things you're investing in. There is more certainty, especially in the stock market, the longer time horizon you have. But over 8 years, it's really difficult to estimate how fast you can expect this money to grow. Do you guys think it would be helpful to talk about that point a little bit more, or should I just kind of keep going?
No, I think it's good to talk about it. And there was another point that that he made in his book about the fact that this savings account is completely different from the other kinds of savings accounts you have for retirement. Retirement, you're taking a little bit out at a time. You could still be working and putting money in, but this one, you pretty much are draining it all at once. So he made that point that you have to realize you're pulling it all out all at once. And that also this one is also more urgent to make sure it's not in the stock market.
Yeah.
When it comes time for your child to go into college, because once again, you need that huge chunk, and you have to know that the big chunk is there. It's
Yeah.
not like a retirement fund where you could probably weather it a little bit longer and wait for the market to come back up. So I thought those were interesting points.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. That's a really good point. It's like that. If you're in retirement, your glide path might go from 90% stocks to 50% stocks or 40% stocks forever, right? Because you're hoping for a long drawdown period. Whereas with college, you kind of have a short ramp up period and then a very fast drawdown period, like you said, right? Where it's like, okay, this is coming out in 4 or 5 years, right? And so we don't really want to put that money at risk. That, like, this is another difference between my calculator and Schwab, is on this top part, kind of my assumption is that you need to kind of have all 160 in the bank if your goal is to pay for 4 years of tuition, because you're not going to get additional growth during freshman year or sophomore year or junior year, because you're probably in cash at that point, if that makes sense. But like, if to spend a little bit more time on the rate of return number, I'm going to delete this part and just go through this like really quickly, just as a thought process, right? Like in these 529 plans, you basically have three types of things that you can invest in, right? You can put your money in cash or a money market. We know, based on the cash accounts that you probably already have, that your expected rate of return in those accounts is, as of right now, basically 0. Maybe over the next 8 years that Laurie's saving for this, maybe interest rates tick up at some point and hit like a whopping 1%, but maybe not, right? The main point is like, okay, in cash, we know your expected rate of return is very low, but it's very safe, right? Your next option is bonds, right? Which are that's essentially loans that you're making to companies, countries, whoever. You lend someone money, they pay you interest, and at the end of the bond, you get your money back. In a low interest rate environment, bond yields are also very low. I mean, a 10-year bond, if you loan money to the US Treasury for 10 years, I think your interest rate is something like 1.2% today. It's gone as high as 1.7% this year, but we're still talking very low rates. So maybe we could get 2 to 3% per year if we invest in bonds. Stocks are, over very long periods of time, we would expect stocks to return their historical average somewhere 9–10% over 30 years, but we don't have 30 years, we have 8 years, right? There are lots of periods of time, there are lots of 8-year periods where the market is up 2% per year, or 0% per year, or negative per year, right? There are also 8-year periods of time where the market is up 15% per year. And starting from today, we don't know what the next 8 years is going to hold for us. So that makes this part really tricky, right? Like, I usually say, like, okay, over 8 to 10 years, maybe we could expect 5 to 10% per year, right? It could be lower, it could be higher, but it's a really wide range of outcomes, which makes this decision that Laurie has to make, a little bit difficult. Because in order to get this rate of return that we expect, we have to look at these expected rates of return over time and figure out, well, Laurie, what are you going to invest in over this period of time? Are you going to be mostly safe? Or are you going to be mostly aggressive? Are you going to split it 50-50? Are you going to be 90% stocks, 10% bonds? Because that will determine what number we can put into our expected rate of return over time. Knowing that over such a short time period, we can't know. We are making a forecast and doing our best here. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So a couple of questions. First, I have totally avoided 529.
Yeah.
And so I know that they exist and they're for school, and that's pretty much the limit of my knowledge. Is there can you invest in both stocks and bonds within a 529, or it really is the plan, you don't really get a say-so in a 529, it's whatever the plan admin or whomever invests in?
Yeah, that's a really good question, which I'm sure, and Laurie will go into more detail, but just to answer that question now, in a 529, I think of it as for your questions perspective, thinking of it as similar to a 401k in that you have a limited list of options. But on that list, you have stocks, bonds, money market accounts, you have target date funds like you would have in a 401k, which are based on the child's age, or you have, like, you can pick like the aggressive mix or the moderate mix or the conservative mix. So you have control as the owner over what you are invested in. So you would be able to come up with the solution that's appropriate for you. That's the answer to this question. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Because my next question, you know, was, I didn't know if it was locked down, right? So you do have a sense of control. That's useful. My next question is, typically, right, I've heard many people say that if you are wanting the money within 10 years or less, that stocks are a little bit too risky, right? There's a lot of people of that thought process, right?
Sure.
So I don't know if I'm the only mama here who was like rolling the dice and telling the kid, you better get a full ride, dude, because I don't have a plan. But I don't have 8 years. And so, so I'm pretty much like I have like 4 years. I have 4 stinking years, right?
Yeah.
4 years.
So that's where I was kind of going with this when you're looking at this. I love where you're breaking it down on the rate of return, right?
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was a point, like if you were, you know, it's more risky if you're going to invest, you know, in a 529 within stocks and you expect the money within 4 years, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't know if you had just thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, you're probably not the only person who's thinking about that exact thing. So I would say, can I come back to you, Sandy, in a minute after I do this one with Laurie, and like we kind of talk about, because we have longer time horizons.
Either that,
or
or
maybe, yeah. Or
maybe at the end, since we have so few people, maybe at the end we could talk about people's individual issues, like.
Because then we could.
I think that's a really good point, Sandy.
Yeah, because then Sandy, you would have a chance to hear about the particulars of the 529, which might lead to further questions. Because I think that I definitely want to come back to that question that you asked, because it's a really good one. Does that work to kind of wait maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. All good.
Cool. Okay, so Laurie, here with your 8-year time horizon and your $160,000 goal, do you have an idea of like what your preference would be in order to start investing?
I could see why you chose 6.5 now. I would probably be in at least 80% stock. Maybe I'm usually like to go really aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably do that at least.
Okay, so the way that you get to this target rate of return number now is here. You know what? I'm going to put an actual number in here. I'm going to say, okay, between 2 and 3%, we're going to assume that bonds return 2.5%, and in stocks, I'm going to assume 6% because I just can't bring myself to assume anything higher than that on such a short time horizon. So what you do is you just multiply the 2.5% by 20 and make your cell a little bit bigger. And then you say, okay, 80% of the portfolio is going to get a 6% rate of return over that period of time. So this is how you figure out like which stocks will contribute 0.5% to your overall return in this split. And sorry, bonds will contribute 0.5% per year and stocks will contribute 4.8% per year. Does that make sense? So that gets us to 5.3. It could be higher, right? If the stock market does well. In an 80-20 portfolio, this whole thing is going to be driven by the stock market. If the stock market does worse, then that actual rate of return is going to be lower than 5.3, but at least gives us something to put into the calculator, right? We're making some sort of mindful decision here. We know we're trying to get to 160, so that's our target future value in our time value of money calculations. And so now we have enough information to calculate payment. So this is how much does Laurie need to put into this account each year in order to have this work out. Start from 35, get to 160. And so the calculator spits out the number, $11,000 per year. And so then Laurie looks at that number and she figures out whether she can do that or not, right? And that's going to be, this is now where the really hard discussions start coming into play, right? Because if you look at that number and you're like, we can't do that as a family, we can't save that much, then we go back to our inputs and figure out where can we make some changes. You could come back to the rate of return and say, oh man, like we can't afford to be conservative. We just have to go for it and have 100% of this 529 in stocks and hope for the best and hope for a higher rate of return, right? That didn't really help us that much in this case. So that doesn't seem like an awesome option. So I would say at that point, it becomes like, okay, we have to reconsider what our future value target is. Instead of this goal of being able to pay, full tuition for 4 years, maybe our future value target is something else. Maybe instead of 160, maybe we're just going to try to get to 100. Right? Okay, so that's $4,800 per year that we need to put in here. Maybe that's more palatable, right? So I think that like doing these calculations is helpful, because if you just started here, you got to this $11,000 number, or let's say you're preparing for rice, right? Like, okay, now now we can see where a $40,000 or $39,000 savings number might be like, that's going to leave a mark in a lot of people's budgets, right?
Oh, and there's no way, we're going to talk about it later, but there's limits on how much you can put in it per year.
Right.
So,
I mean,
so
like there's lots,
too.
There's lots of limits,
Yeah.
but I think where a lot of people kind of run into, like they kind of let this part of the calculation stop them, where it's like, if I can't pay for all of it, then what's the point, right? Like I'm never going to be able to do this. There's so much room in between here, right? Where you can say, okay, if we go back to the original UT calculation, you can say, okay, we think our family can afford to responsibly set aside 160 for school for this child. And then if they get into rice, we're going to have a very adult conversation with our 18-year-old child about what that means. Does it mean you don't go to rice, but you do go to UT if you get in both places? Or does it mean the child accepts that they are going to be taking on student loans? Does the parent decide to step in and take on student loans, right? So there's a whole discussion there, but going back to Laurie's point about the starting to save, like I do believe that if you want to be able to contribute something, no matter what that number is, you start doing it, right? You open the account and you start putting money in to some degree. And then you figure out like what type of planning do you want to mindfully participate in, but also be realistic about what you can do, right? If you can't, that you don't have to save for 4 years of Yale and then Harvard Law School and commit to all of that if it's not financially feasible, because you're just putting yourself in a really tough position. And people you don't have to do that. But if you choose to do this planning, then it's a really good idea to run the numbers. I always think it's like, if you're starting from the very beginning, I mean, you can run these numbers and then say like 160 is probably out of reach. Let's start with, I mean, what can you save? $10,000? Like, how do you get to 10,000? How do you get to 15,000, which as a gift that you're giving, we have to do this. Like as a gift you're giving your child is a wonderful gift to give. So don't, cut that short, that even if it's not 160, $10,000 is still an amazing gift to give to your child. So, and that's $1,000 per year in this situation. So I just wanted to run through this pretty quickly, like the planning piece of it, right? Like, how are we going to get from here to there? Is this plan as it's laid out here feasible? And if it's not feasible, what's the alternative, right? Because there's lots of room. I talk to a lot of people just in my line of work who think that the expectation for every parent is to pay for all of their kids to go to college. And that's not true, right? Like every person, every parent needs to figure out what their expectation is for themselves and their family and what's right for them and their family. And then you can do some planning around that. Are there any questions on this piece? In addition to Sandy's question, which we'll come back to towards the end. Does it make sense how all the numbers work together? Was that relatively clear? Cool. All right. Well then, Laurie, do you want to go back to talking about 529s? We can always come back to time value of money. You guys know that I'll create a whole new spreadsheet from scratch if you want to.
Oh,
So
I love that. That was great. That's very useful. It makes things more concrete, and so it makes it a little less scary.
Yeah. All right. You're back on, Laurie.
Okay, let me try. Okay. So this is the end of that discussion. Okay. So now we're going to talk more about the nitty gritty of the 529. So typically the parent will own the 529, and then you have a beneficiary, which is the child or the niece or the nephew or the aunt. There's actually a lot of people that it could benefit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So lots of people worry that it's going to reduce their financial aid, and it won't reduce it as much as you might think. There's a limit to how much it will reduce it. As a parent, if it's owned by the parent, it will only reduce it by 5.64% because of some rule they made several years ago. So you'll probably still have a benefit greater than that by investing in the 529. And they really kind of penalize if you're an independent student. If you have a 529, they're going to reduce your aid by 20%, and even more if it came from the grandparent. So if you're starting out, it's better for it to be owned by the parent. The grandparent or the aunt or whoever, they can still gift the money into the 529 that's owned by the parent. And there's ways, if you have one and it's already owned by the grandparent, there's apparently lots of little mechanisms that you can use so that when they look at how much financial aid you should get, they can get it out of the grandparents' fund into yours. You could roll over a certain amount into the parents' fund, or reassign that 529 to be owned by the parent. There's lots of strange little rules that I'm not going to go over right now. But so don't worry, if a grandparent started it, don't panic. There's ways you can do it, but your goal is to have it owned by the parent to make it better for you when they're determining how much financial aid you get. Like I said, these are gifted to the beneficiary, and so you can gift yearly $15,000 per person or $30,000 as a couple to an individual without having to pay gift tax. So that's where those values come from. And anybody can gift it to that individual, to the beneficiary, and it can go right into the account. You can also do what they call super funding, which is taking all of those amounts that you would have done normally over 5 years and just do it all at once. So like you can gift up to $150,000 as a couple or $75,000 per person. You do have to fill out tax form 709, because otherwise the IRS will think you gifted more than the limit of $15,000 and $30,000. But the reason you might want to do that, if you have money laying around or that you've just inherited, is because you get the compounding on that. You've just increased your principal a lot all at once, and it can be compounding over those 5 years. So I did this year because I inherited money from my dad. So I gifted it over a 5-year time into the fund. And I did it with Fidelity, and it was really easy just doing it online. I didn't realize I had to do the special tax form, but it makes sense because otherwise the IRS thinks you over gifted someone. And the catch on this is that since you're doing it for the next 5 years, you cannot gift it over those 5-year periods. You have to actually wait in your plan and then start again after 5 years. So you have to kind of remember, oh, I got to start again in 5 years.
You're like front loading the contributions, like one big front loading, but then you have to stop for those years that you already used up the contributions, right?
Right. Right. Does that make sense to everybody?
Is this the way you contribute, or is this another like back door?
No, this is how you contribute. Any funds into the account are like gifted to the beneficiary, even though they don't own the account.
So if you have one person who is going to contribute to a 529, you can only put 15,000 a year into it?
Yes. Yes.
Then it's impossible to catch up.
Well, other people can gift money in too.
I know. I'm ready. You can contribute. My poor child has no living relatives left. I am his only lifeline.
Yes, you would be limited then you'd be limited to that 5 years, right? Because he would start school before the 5th year, right? But I think you could still do the 5-year contribution this year if you had that cash laying around, right, to plug in there, even though he's starting in 4 years. It's like you could front load it for the 5. Again, if you have that type of cash laying around today.
Well, I did pay private tuition for the last freaking damn 9 years, which is why I don't have a 529. So I get a 4-year break because we're going to do public high school. Yay.
Yay. So that's good. That's good. There's some money you can shovel off over into the 529. Let's see. For some reason, my chat doesn't pop up, so I can't see if anybody's asking questions. All right, well, let me know if anybody has any questions in the chat. Okay, so 529 eligible expenses. When you spend the money in the 529 on these things, there are no tax consequences. These are the things that you can use. Tuition, fees, books, supplies, and equipment at colleges, universities. And they recently opened it up with the Secure Act to include more of these schools. So art school, even if it's like a 2-year school, might be included. And I think you have to go to that school and ask them if they're in the category that you could use your 529 money. And it also said certain apprenticeship programs. Apparently if it's an apprenticeship program, it has to be registered in a certain way. And I didn't do research on exactly what that means, but I know that you can. So that might be something you want to pursue. On a list, it said some room and board expenses, if you're on campus, can be included. For example, if you buy like a food plan that they can use in the school cafeteria, that would be included. If they're in a dorm, that could be included. And it may also include off-campus rent and food. But I didn't see how they would actually manage to do that. But they said in some cases it might. This is a new one that I didn't know about: computers, cost of the software, and cost of internet access. I was very surprised by that one because, I mean, everybody's going to need that. If there's any expenses related to special needs kids, like some kids have like a helper that helps them with their stuff or carries their stuff from place to place, that would apply to that. And then if you had a lot in your 529, you could use it to pay for elementary, middle, or secondary school, high school. So up to $10,000 a year to pay for those. And you could also use $10,000 of it on a loan payment, which is kind of cool. So even if you didn't use all the money and you tried to find all of those things that you can rename the beneficiary, and it can be someone in your, it's not your complete extended family, but your close family. So that would be the beneficiary's sibling, first cousin, grandparent, aunt, niece, stepdaughter, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. And apparently once you start going into the stepdaughter and stepson, there's even relationships there that you can follow and say that you can even help them pay for college. Apparently to do some of those things, you might have to change the beneficiary and then change it again for it to move to the right relationship. But apparently there's a way to do that. And it also said that if most funds apparently don't let you change the beneficiary more than once a year. So it's not something you can bounce around and do, but it is something you can do. So this actually makes me feel a little bit better because at least you could give the money to somebody. You can even give it to yourself. So if you have money in the fund and you're not planning on going back to school, are there any things that you might like to take at ACC, like a floral design course? Or would you like to learn more photography or sculpture or painting? It can be used for those types of things too on your behalf, because you would own it, but you would also be the beneficiary. So there's another way to get the money out, to get the value out of the 529. And then if the beneficiary becomes disabled after 26, there's a different type of fund for disabled people called ABLE. And apparently you can roll the money over into there. So that won't really affect very many people, but I mention it because you never know what's going to happen and might wish you had known about it. The reason you don't want to pull the money out for anything else is because you will then pay income tax on the gains because you were earning money tax-free, and there's a 10% penalty when you withdraw it. Does that make sense? I mean, it's kind of weird, I know, like all these people you can make beneficiaries, but apparently they were actually doing something in Congress and trying to make this more useful. Who would know?
Hey, Laurie.
Oh, yeah? Yeah.
I had a question.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I think Sara answered it, saying that it's a student loan. Okay. I had a question that when you say you can pay off loan expenses, I was thinking what kind of loans is that?
Student loan, educational loans.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Just a quick comment. I don't know if anybody uses these anymore, but my two oldest children had UTMAs, and hopefully nobody does anymore. But if your money started in an UTMA and you moved it to a 529, all the rules that apply to it are the UTMA rules, and they don't let you move it around to other different beneficiaries. It's really bad, so I wouldn't get an UTMA.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because that tends to be the other account that people think of. So UTMA, Uniform Transfer to Minors Act accounts, it's similar to the 529 in that you are transferring the money to someone else, right? You're gifting the money to someone else. But in the case of an UTMA, the child becomes the owner no matter what when they reach the age of majority, which is not the case with a 529. The 529, the owner always stays the owner and they designate a beneficiary. With a UTMA, you put $10,000 into an account for your kid. In Texas, when that kid reaches age 21, it's their money. Like you have given up all control over it. And so they don't want people changing the registration on those accounts after, because you've given the money to the kid, you're not supposed to take the money back from the UTMA. So I think that's a really excellent point to bring up on that account. And we can also talk more about UTMA specifically, maybe after we finish up with the 529s.
So as Sarah was showing us, you have to basically strategize, figure out what your plan is and at least start working a plan, even if it changes later. So here's one plan that you could say. You could say, well, we're going to try and save 50%, and we're going to say 25% for student loans, which actually have excellent rates, and when I'm only going to talk a little bit about student loans because I don't know that much about them. But one thing that's nice is if the student is out in the workforce, if they're not earning as much money as they thought they would, the loan amount, the monthly loan amount can be adjusted, which is not something you'll see with other loans. In home equity loans would also be a possibility if you can get better rates, because I'm thinking the parent loans are probably not the best loans to get. So you might actually have a home equity loan that might be better rates. And you could say, well, we're still going to be working then. Let's look at our budget and assume that when that time comes, we will make sure there's that much of our income is just going to be sent to the school. So this is just an idea of what you could do, because you can move this around however you want. Save 25% and assume you're going to do 50% loans, and then 25% income. So this is just a suggestion for ways that you can manage it and not feel overwhelmed that you have to pay for the full amount by the time it happens, by the time the kid goes to school. Okay, so here's a couple of the resources that I used and thought looked good. This is the book I read, The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make. While his subtitle again was, while still not really knowing how much money it's going to cost in the end. Because a lot of the times you have to have been admitted to the school, and then later you will get a letter that says, here's how much money we're going to give you. So this is how much it really is. And apparently, if you're lucky, you will have a couple of weeks to decide between all these other colleges and maybe even negotiate with them. So like I said, that's another topic, which is, how do I pick the college? How do I get the financial aid? Should I go to some schools hoping to get a full ride? Are there schools that are still offering full rides? Basically, what do I do for that? It's like, Sandy's going to have to deal with that sooner than me, but I am very happy to push that off at least 8 years. There's these websites that look good. The College Financial Lady, she has a bunch of articles on savings and what to do, and basically helping you out, helping you understand what's going on. Saving for College, this one focuses a lot on this part of it. Saving for College, 529, what does it all mean? It had some nice, a nice comparison tool where you could look at some of the different 529 plans to compare them and decide which one you wanted. College Board's Big Future. This one, it kind of looks like a hodgepodge of stuff. So it has a calculator on there that should help you figure out how much you might need. I don't know how useful this one is, but I included it just because it seemed to have like almost everything you could think of. And in the book, he mentioned this particular Facebook, Paying for College 101. It's a private group, but you can just request to be added, and you'll be added. And it's parents basically trying to figure this out, and giving their suggestions for what they're doing or what they did since they just went through it. So that sounded like a really useful Facebook group. So that's pretty much all I have to talk about. Maybe we can talk about individual things like Sandy's thing, or talk about anything in general, questions or just discussions. Maybe let's start with Sandy's question because, well, she already mentioned it.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna bring back up that spreadsheet for Sandy, because I think that now we can fill in some of the other pieces. Like, and in Sandy's particular situation, like, what's the plan that we need to figure out, like, right now? Like, this is coming up fast, right? So what are your options? And a lot of, you know, some of these things actually apply to retirement planning in the same way. Like, oh, we need to get ready right away. What should we do? So here, I'm going to pull up my spreadsheet again here. Because my thoughts on that, Sandy, so you said in the chat that you think 4 years of art school, right? Or something like that. I mean, the kind of the first step is figuring out, well, I guess you have experience paying for private school already. You get a 4-year break, but if we go back to, I mean, if you just want to throw out a number, like, what had you been paying for private school, or what would be in the budget for private school that theoretically you could continue or start paying again when your son goes to college? Does that make sense? It's like you had a line item in the budget for private school tuition. Like, so you were making that happen at some point. Is it feasible to save that much money over the next 4 years, or is it not feasible anymore? Did that question make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, I gave myself a break for a few months, but the goal is still to at least save $10,000 a year. That's the minimum. Is what I'm still contributing to it. I just am not at the same rate that I was, right?
Yeah. Okay, so if we come here, if we just kind of update the numbers, right, and say, okay, let's assume a $26,000 annual cost. Let's assume the 5.5% rate of inflation for tuition. Years until college is 4, right? So the future annual cost, if we use UT as kind of the benchmark tuition level, tuition will only be at $32,000 per year in 4 years at that rate. So that part works in your favor, right? You don't have as many years of inflation to contend with here. So if we're kind of using that as the target, it puts like, okay, if you were going to pay for 4 years at $32,000 per year, that puts this future value target at 129, basically 128 or 129 per year. I think you already said that, like, you haven't started an account you haven't started a 529 yet. Like, there is no designated educational account right this very second. Is that right?
Yep, just an abysmal cash money market.
Well, what's in the money market?
Let's just call it 10,000.
Great. So that counts, right? And we'll figure out, because you could always invest that money if you wanted to do that, right? But so you're starting with 10, 4 years till college. So now I think what started your question was a really excellent one about what's the expected rate of return over 4 years in this case. So as we get shorter and shorter time horizons, your expectation for returns is, especially for the stock market, the expectations get wider and wider, right? There are lots of people who think that at today's prices in the stock market in general, we are setting ourselves up for lower short-term returns in the future because we've pulled a lot of those returns forward to the present day. That might be true. It might not be true. We don't know, right? But an argument could be made here that your expectation for stock returns over the next 4 years might not be that awesome because we've had relatively high returns, certainly over the last year, 18 months. But even before that, returns on stocks were relatively high before the pandemic. So, I mean, the hardest thing to estimate here for rate of return is, like, what could you expect from the stocks portion of this hypothetical hypothetical portfolio that we're trying to think through for you. I mean, if I was doing this calculation, which I guess I am because it's my spreadsheet, I would say I would put like a 4 in there. I would say maybe you get 4% per year for the next 4 years. That puts it at higher than what we would expect for bonds. I would also bring this bonds number down by a bit. And I'd put cash at 0 over 4 years. So if going from a 100% money market investment account to an 80% stocks investment account is a pretty big jump. So here within the spreadsheet that I'm looking at now, I have, you know, this education account, like whatever the money's actually sitting in, the money earmarked for education, I have it under Laurie's preferred allocation, which is 80% stocks, 20% bonds. Would you be in the same boat as Laurie, or would you be more aggressive, or would you be more conservative?
Yeah, I think I would definitely, I think at this point I would probably be more aggressive. And I'm also wondering what other, in the bonds category, in the 529s, from what you know with like Vanguard, what type of bonds are available? Is there any other, is there a variety of bonds available that would change the rate of return might decrease, but the risk level also decreases?
That's a really good question. You know, I had Vanguard pulled up here, and we might actually be able to get the answer to that question. Choose investments for your 529 account, because you're like going back to what your options are in the 529, they are limited. So you definitely have options. Check out our individual portfolios. You definitely have like regular bond options, right? Like investment grade, meaning they're not junk bonds. Oh, here we go. Here's what you have available to you. You could do a money market. You could do a high yield bond portfolio, which has higher expected returns, but also higher risk, right? You have something they're calling income portfolio. You basically have 4 options for bonds. Let's see, over here, kind of the returns that those bond funds have gotten over 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, year to date. I mean, it's still over 1 year. Junk bonds are kind of they're the highest risk type of bond. In good times, they have the highest returns. In bad times, they have the lowest returns. So you could theoretically kind of go out on the risk spectrum into junk bonds for the bond portion of that 529 portfolio in order to try to get a higher return over 1 year, right? Or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. But anytime you do that, you're leaving yourself exposed to a down year. I think you already know that, right? Like you know that general dynamic. But you don't have a ton of options. You only have 4 options to choose from in the 529, right? Total bond market, which is just all the bonds. Inflation protected bonds, which tend to be low risk, low return. An income portfolio, which I can see right here, very low risk, very low return. And then junk bonds or high yield bonds, which is higher risk, higher expected returns over longer periods of time. Junk bonds they're closer to stocks than they are to bonds, I would say, if that makes sense, as far as risk return trade-off. And then like as for the stocks portion of your portfolio, you can see here, like you know, instead of the entire universe of stocks available to you, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, basically have 9 options to choose from in the 529. So I don't know if that answered your question on like what you can choose from, but
yeah, super helpful. And now that, and I don't want to derail the entire conversation, right? But I'm now kind of curious what your thoughts are. So 529s versus UTMAs, right? The whole goal is to take cash and make a return on that, right? That's the whole goal, right? To afford college. Other than a UTMA would be would it go against a child who is 18 going into college? Because technically in the state of Texas, they're they technically don't own that money yet. I'm just wondering what the disadvantages are. So if I'm limited in the portfolio options within a 529, and if I do a UTMA, that my universe expands of what I can invest in. Now I'm like looking at that comparison of 529 versus UTMA. And what are the disadvantages to each? And I think the disadvantage to UTMA is that it goes against it goes towards the child's, I guess, assets and income, and that's taken into consideration for financial aid. Is there any other downside to that?
That's the big downside, is that in Texas at age 21, these accounts, whatever's in them, the accounts become the child's. And then when they fill out their FAFSA, if the child owns assets, that the universities tend to assume that all of that money that the child owns, or at this point, they're the age of majority, so that the student owns, that all of the assets the student owns are available to use for college, right?
Would that apply if they're 18, right? Like if they're 18 and he has still a couple of more years before the UTMA is totally his, I don't know if the university actually takes that into consideration, because technically the funds are not his,
right. So
but they are his.
So in that case, it comes into play during the last couple of years, right? That you're trying to like defer the time when the university, or when the child, when the student owns the assets. But at age 21, I mean, a lot of kids have 1 or 2 years left of school left. So maybe you had qualified for some sort of financial aid up until that point, then they reach the age of majority, and now that's gone. And the money that you put in the UTMA for your child is now, I mean, the university assumes that they're going to use that for college. But then what if the kid doesn't use it for college? They've just wiped out their financial aid and are refusing to use it for college, right? So then what happens? So it's a little, so I think that part for the UTMA is where you can imagine, like in states where it's 18, it's a real problem, right? Because it's like freshman year, all right, like we're seeing that this kid now owns $25,000 worth of Apple. We're just going to assume that the kid's going to use that $25,000 worth of Apple to pay for college, and he or she doesn't qualify for any financial aid. So like if there's like the timing discussion, like I see your point, and I mean, it depends on kind of, I think what the timing of it would be, but it's a risk for using that type of account. And I would say, like, how important is it for the parent or the grandparent or the whoever is gifting this money in the UTMA account? How important is it to that person who's giving the gift for the money to be in the kid's name as of the age of majority? Do you know what I mean? Like from a parent's perspective, if I'm going to give my kid $25,000, I'd probably just keep it in my own name until I give it to them, right? If that makes sense. Like I wouldn't give it to them as a minor and set up a UTMA account. I would keep it in my own name and give it to them maybe after they graduate, or, to help pay off student loans, or, whatever, kind of when they get through these college planning years.
So can you gift, so I do have a UTMA for my child, but it was not for college. It was my main goal was I want him to invest, and he can't invest in a Roth yet, and he can't invest anywhere else, right? That was, if I wanted to invest, and I didn't know if I invested personally in my name, you can't really roll over that unless I don't know. Like, is there a way an adult, like if I have investment accounts and he becomes of age, right, that he is 18 or 21 and he can own investments, is there a transfer that way, right? I didn't know I didn't know of a way that could occur. I also personally, speaking of so that's one thing so my intent with UTMA was a little different. Mm-hmm. And then I also intend to, he has to have skin in the game when he goes to school. I have a friend of mine, and she said, she told both of her kids, I'm going to give you, I think, $80,000 to go to school, and it's yours. And if you don't want to go to school, I'll still give you $80,000. But if you go to school, you got 80,000. When it runs out, figure it out, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, that was her thing. And I think I like the idea of having skin in the game as well, right? So I'm going to have, you know, you can go to school, I'll pay for a percentage of it, provided that you're attending class and your grades are there and all that good stuff, right? So I do expect for him to bring something to the table, but I didn't know, you know, going back to that conversation, I don't necessarily anticipate him to, you know, use the UTMA for school. But I am wondering, is there another way to transfer, you know, investments, right, from an adult to another adult? Can you do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can gift people shares of stock. You end up gifting them your cost basis as well. But you can do that. If you bought 100 shares of Apple today, and then eventually wanted to gift those 100 shares to any other person in the future, you can gift them. Well, you're still going to have the $15,000 limit or whatever the gift limit is, or, you know, if you go over it, then you have to file tax forms to declare it. But if you wanted to transfer $15,000 worth of stocks or some other type of asset to any other person, whether they're related to you or not, you can do that. It doesn't have to be cash.
Cool. And there's no limitation, right? So index funds versus individual stocks doesn't really matter, just whatever an asset is, but you're still stuck at that 15,000.
Yeah.
My goal is for him to have just basically a lot of freaking money at a much earlier age than I did.
Yeah.
Obviously teaching him good financial hygiene between now and then, which he already kind of gets to hear some of this stuff from me, even though he rolls his eyes and doesn't seem, he's starting to care now because he does have a check card and he's got a girlfriend, and I'm seeing that debit card get used. So it's cool. But so going back to the spreadsheet, you know, and the original question you asked, I probably, you know, this is where for me, if I have 4 years and I kind of play around with the numbers, this is where it kind of helps me to say, you know what, if you're not willing to take a greater risk, then this is what you're going to, this is the deficit, the gap that you're going to have to figure out when the time comes, right? And that to me is the trade-off. It's like, okay, do I roll the dice and do I increase that, you know, to, you know, like, 100% all in on stock and see what that does?
Yeah. I mean, to get to that same end goal over 4 years, the rate of return actually becomes a lot less important over 4 years. I mean, let's put in let's say you get 10% for 4 years. Your annual payment to get to the 128 actually only went to $25,000-ish from 27, right? So you, on the shorter time horizon, and this is true for retirement planning as well, if you have only a handful of years, compounding does less of the work over shorter periods of time. And so that, I think, is going to be, you could be 100% stocks and then just say, like, I'm going to take what the market gives me. Like, even if it gives you 0%, okay, well, then you would have to save $30,000 a year to get to the 128 goal, assuming you want to fully fund this thing, right? So, and if you got 10%, which is probably the high end of the estimate, you would only have to save 25. So you have to save between $25,000 and $30,000 a year over the next 4 years in order to meet that goal. If you came over with a baby, right, and you had 18 years, the power of compounding would be much more powerful. You would be able to save less money per year, assume that compounding would do more of the work, and have a lower payment that you would need to make into this 529 to reach your goals.
Yeah, awesome. And then I guess, then we still reach the limit of the 15,000 per year per person gift, right?
Right.
So you couldn't even put this into a 529. That was the other reasoning for a UTMA, right? Was there is no, to my knowledge, I can put as much as I want in that thing.
Oh, hold on, sorry. That was the wrong thing. I mean, yeah, with the 529, you're gonna run into, you're gonna run into those gifting goals or those gifting limits unless you front load them and file the tax form that Laurie filed. With the UTMA, if you go over the gifting limits, you still have to file the tax form. You don't pay extra tax. You just have to file the tax form that says, hey, I exceeded the gift tax limits. My estate that is eligible for an estate tax exemption if I die is reduced by the amount that I went over. But there's no technical limits on it, like there kind of are on the 529 plan. I mean, and in this case where you're making, the shorter term decisions, like Laurie mentioned this, right? Like what are your sources of helping pay for college, right? Like Laurie mentioned, like earnings, if you're still working, right? Like maybe it's $1,000 a month or $2,000 per month that you just send to you send to the school. I also want to mention for people, I kind of made this list of like, okay, earnings, if you're still working, savings, and educational accounts, which is what we're talking about here. Laurie already mentioned something like a home equity loan or a home equity line of credit if you're willing to use your home as collateral to basically make a loan to yourself. And then on retirement accounts, you can make penalty-free distributions from your retirement accounts. So even if you're not 59 and a half, you can make penalty-free distributions from retirement accounts if that goes to qualified educational expenses. So if you have done an awesome job saving for retirement and you do these calculations, like okay, like I'm ahead of the game on retirement, maybe that ends up being a source of money instead of thinking it as money for retirement. If you already have enough saved for retirement and can afford to skim some money out of those retirement accounts, you can take money out of retirement accounts penalty-free if you're not 59 and a half yet. And then of course, the next option is loans.
Is that out of both traditional IRA as well as Roth, or can you only take out the gains from the Roth?
No, it's out of any of them. So out of the Roth, it would come out penalty-free, but like a Roth distribution. And out of a traditional or a 401k, you would pay the taxes on it like you would otherwise, but not have to pay the 10% penalty.
So why don't you have to pay the penalty? I missed part of it. Is it if it goes towards an educational?
It's one of the exceptions to the 10% penalty rules for taking early distributions from your retirement accounts. Usually can't, right?
Is there rules about the relation, right? So if it's my retirement account that I take money out for educational purposes for myself or a child, or does that really apply? Like, can I randomly just go around paying for people's school if I chose?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. If you could just become the like, you get tuition, like Oprah tuition fairy. I don't know the answer to that question. If it has to be like someone in your household, that would be, you have to dig into the IRS rules for that.
But that's good to know. There is some options, right? I mean,
yes.
The common theme that I'm hearing is save, just save and plan. And there's different vehicles to do that, but choosing one or many is going to be better than not doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and also not included, which Laurie alluded to this, was like, okay, is it going to make more sense for your kid to do 1 or 2 years at a junior college, right? Where it's less expensive, or get some credits while they're still in high school, like kind of all of these other kind of financial engineering or different choices that you can make as you get closer and closer to it. Like if you're running the numbers and you're like, my kid is, going to want to go to Rice. We're not going to be able to afford it. Like, okay, well then does it need to be on the table that they do 2 years at ACC and then transfer, right? Does that become the plan? And if so, can you prepare for that, right? So you can get more creative with it than I think what everybody's paralyzing fear is, which is, oh my God, it's going to be $250,000. I don't have $250,000, so I'm not even going to try, right? So it's just like, okay, we can be a little bit creative and also be, be gentle with ourselves as to, what we can honestly afford when it comes to giving a gift like this to our children, right? Because in addition to giving them the gift of education, you can also give them the gift of being financially stable when you're retired. That, to me, I think is a more valuable gift, right? That they don't have to be the people who worry about you when you're older. Because I see that a lot too, right? I have people who come in and say, like, my parents aren't ready for retirement. I don't know what I'm going to do when they need help, the sandwich generation type of dilemma. So if, you're at the point where you're like, I'm just not going to be able to contribute a ton to educational expenses, that's okay. Like, it's okay to take care of yourself in this case, because it's actually an amazing gift that you give your kids down the road to be ready for retirement, right? Or readier than you otherwise would be if you sacrificed everything to pay for their school, when it's just not financially feasible to do that. So that was
Sarah.
I digress. Yeah.
This is Caitlin. You just said exactly what I was wondering about, and if memory serves, you said before, and I was thinking, like, okay, I also don't have a 529. All right, instead of contributing to my Roth, I get, like, if there's this limited pool of money, does it make sense that I have to save for this type of account? Does it make sense to then have what I'm putting in the Roth just so that I have something to put in the 529? And I've always thought, no, it doesn't, because if I have that in the Roth, I'm more prepared to help my daughter, at least with her student loans, because I'm not going to be able to do her whole tuition. But knowing that I could help her pay them off when she has her first job, that I could alleviate her stress then, that seems pretty impactful too, or just a nice story I tell myself about my 29. But you just valid. So I was going to ask, like, wait, what about this other plan where I do as much as I can for my retirement, but then I can help her with that later too, because then I have a much longer time to grow that money too, right?
Right. Yes. I mean, I think that is a totally valid, and for probably most people, a more feasible plan is like, I'm just gonna, like, all of my savings goes to retirement because I'm not quite ready for that yet. I still need to get ready for retirement. And so as you can keep that money, control that money, make, good investing decisions with that money over longer periods of time, you're also not constrained by this really rough, shorter term time horizon in the 529, right? Where it's just like, oh, like, do you put it in stocks? Do you not? Like, you're really at the whim of the short-term stock market, which can be kind of rough. So I think, like, in the case where there's just not enough to do both, but if you concentrate on the retirement side, give yourself 20 years to grow that money and know that you can always come back later, like you said, and help your kid, not just in college, but beyond, with helping pay off student loans or whatever gifts you give your kids over your lifetime. I think that, yeah, that's a totally valid way of looking at it. Though I will say with the 529, like, in that case where there's really, like, finite resources, I still like the idea of opening and funding a 529, because I don't know, at least I found with my kids, people, like, want to give my kids monetary gifts, right? Sometimes it's like $50 for a birthday or $100 for Christmas. And, people will ask, like, can I donate to can I put money in their college fund? So then I'm like, why, yes, you can, because I have a college fund open for them, right? And so even if a person is like, all of their extra savings is going towards their retirement, if you get, like, this influx of $250 and put it in the 529, then you're also starting that college account, right? And you're able to say to that person, like, why, yes, I do have a college account open for my child. Thank you for sending, money to her. Just, like, have it open. So just, like, having it there, even if you can't max it out or put in enough to make it hit six figures, again, like, even if it's just there and it's being invested and it's compounding and it's growing from 3 figures to 4 figures, that's still going to pay for something when the time comes, which is awesome.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think, Laurie, I wanted to go back to your point that I know comes from Ron Lieber, that, they'll look at your kid skeptically if you haven't started a 529 on their behalf, but that has to be within a certain income bracket, like an income bracket where you made enough to do this, so why didn't you, rather than people that are on the margin. It seems like a very class and educational level judgment about people. It can't be for all incoming students. They have to look at the family picture and what the income level actually is.
Yeah, I think you're right. But it's also an argument against the suggestion that you shouldn't start a 529 plan because you're going to lose out on your financial aid, because
Right.
that's not really the case. So it's like another reason why you should just go ahead and do it. And I think I felt more comfortable knowing there at least it had been started. When my dad started it, back when Sam was really young, and I kind of just ignored it, and it grew a lot. And so it's sort of like free money. But yeah. I have a little comfort feeling at least there is some put away and it's earmarked for college. So, but I know
I totally get that.
There's
and
so many things
to
save for. How can you save for all of them, especially when you look at the huge amount that they supposedly need?
Right. I just think if you're on the margin, someone like me that is not funding my retirement as much as I should, I get so anxious at the idea, well, wait, they're going to not give her finance. But if they look at my full financial picture, they'll be like, yeah, okay. That the 529 also is, if you're in a position to do one and you didn't, there could be a judgment about that. It's hard for me to believe they penalize parents who didn't have enough margin for one, that they didn't have one.
I agree.
One hopes, at least one hopes.
These are awesome questions.
Sorry, another aside, but just about Ron Lieber, I've followed his career a little bit, and I find it very interesting because I think he and his wife have gotten in a lot of financial trouble, which doesn't mean, I think he's a great journalist, and I think him covering finances is super interesting, but he paid for his daughter's wedding, which he could not afford, and it was something like $50,000, and they had to declare bankruptcy or something. He did this, what Sara, I know, has talked about, is people are just I have to pay for college. I have to pay for the wedding. This is what parents do at the expense of their own financial stability in the future. So he and his wife paying for his daughter's very expensive wedding. I don't know how much weddings cost. Maybe it wasn't that exorbitant, but between $40,000 and $50,000, then jeopardized their own financial future, which the daughter will have to pay for in the end. So I think all of these assumptions we make as parents about what a good parent does really mess with our financial planning and what we think is societally okay.
Yeah, I don't, so I even was hesitant to list the book because I don't really agree with everything he puts in there. And it's kind of a thick book that you have to kind of wade through to dig out little nuggets of information. I don't necessarily agree with everything he said. And a lot of it is just his opinion. He decided that, probably if they don't see the 529, they might not, think you're, serious. And he tried to get other people to admit to it and they didn't, but then he still put it in his book. And then I still told you guys. So yeah, definitely I would take what he says with a grain of salt. He did have some good points, but it's not a book I would wholeheartedly recommend.
Well, he needed to make $50,000. So he thought this book would hit the sweet spot, which I think he's correct on, but he had an ulterior motive to write this book.
And I do want to really quickly go back to, Leora just posted in the chat box, if you want to go to the link, that there is a difference between paying with the IRAs is where you can take the penalty-free distributions, but the 401ks, if it's still in a 401k plan, you can borrow and repay in 5 years. So you have to take out a loan from a 401k instead of an early distribution. So those are two different things and different from what I said. So she posted that here in the chat box, and she clarified that it must be for you, your spouse, your children, or your grandchildren. So you can't be everyone gets college tuition vary from using this exception to the penalties. So thank you, Laura. That's super helpful.
But you could, if you had a 401k, you could always take that and roll part of that money into an individual IRA, right? And then you just skirt around the 401k limit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, assuming you could do like if you're still working there, assuming you can do an in-plan rollover, something like that. But it looks like it's a difference in how the accounts are registered, whether it's with as a 401k or an IRA. So that is really good to know, because a lot of people end up, right, if you have a huge 401k at your job and you're still working, and if you're planning on using that as some sort of source, looks like, unless you could do an in-plan rollover, then you would instead need to do something that looks more like a 401k loan that would need to be paid back. Super helpful. These are really good questions, everybody. What else does anybody have, like anecdotes about like what worked for other people or what just like did not work for other people thinking through this?
I have a quick question. When you were talking about paying for college, and I only have one child that's going through college right now, and it's extremely expensive college. But I didn't think we could afford it, but the school like did their little formula and everything, and they're like, and we determined that we're not going to help you at all. Like they didn't. I mean, they gave like they expected my daughter to pay for like 5% or something in loans, but they didn't. Like, I didn't see any point where I could like debate with them or negotiate. Like, where do you negotiate? Like, I didn't see any opening for negotiation. Luckily, a grandparent came in and rescued us, helped us afford the school. But normally, if she hadn't, I don't know. There's no way we could have afforded this school.
I personally don't know anything about negotiating. I would think you could go to the financial aid office and say, I got this other offer from this other school. Would you guys match this aid? But yeah, you have no guarantee that will work out, really.
Yeah, we did early. She did early enrollment, or early decision, and then so. But yeah, I mean, the school is like $85,000 a year. We're crazy. So even though I saved enough for my kids to go to public school, but not like that kind of private school. And even now, I'm sort of like, I don't even know now, like how would, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's up for debate, like how much the school costs.
Can I ask that that determination of how much you or your child would be able to contribute to tuition, did that come from FAFSA or did that come from the university?
I think they came from the university.
Okay, because I remember when I would fill out FAFSA, my family actually did contest it's called the EFC, the expected family contribution, because FAFSA does plug you into, like my parents had to fill out the online form, and then they would calculate how much of my parents' income was supposed to be expected to like go to my tuition, but we would have to provide supporting documentation to FAFSA to contest that. And then they did decrease that expected family contribution, but then that number went to UT, and then UT did their own calculation. So I'm not sure about on the university side if there's a way to contest it, but if the EFC that you got from FAFSA is high, then there may be a way to submit some documents and get that changed.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I don't really remember how.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my experience back in, again, 1997, right? So not super relevant maybe in this day and age, was that like at WashU, where I went to school, Washington University in St. Louis, the financial aid office was very receptive to negotiating, right? Because I also was looking at University of Chicago. So like there was some sort of being able to come back to each school with the packages that were being offered at that time, right? And I also, just like, I grew up, 4 kids, and I grew up on a farm. So we were already very low income to begin with. So I may have been checking a box that Laurie mentioned for like the student population, coming from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. But in that particular case, I remember like having multiple conversations with the financial aid offices from at least those 2 schools. But obviously this is like 25-year-old anecdotal evidence that is probably not super valuable right now. But I think it kind of goes to the point of like every single person's experience is going to be different, which is why it makes it so challenging to try to navigate this. Everyone's doing it in a different way on different terms, which makes it so challenging.
Yeah, and they don't they don't take into account that you have other kids at all unless they're in school. So you can say to them, well, if I give you all this, tuition, I can't save for the others. They don't really care. That it's really pretty ruthless.
Yeah.
What happened in Texas? Like, I know I went to school much earlier than you, and it used to be that tuition was super cheap in Texas, and it's because there was I remember they call it a PUF fund or something, and it was super cheap in the 80s and early 90s. And then something happened and the legislature changed it, and now the tuition just exploded after that. I don't know. Do you remember anything?
I only got here in 2001, so I don't know if does anyone from Texas know the history of that?
It used to be $4 a credit hour at A&M in the 1980s. And that UT wasn't much more than that, but I don't know. It's a shame. I don't know if it's all gone up because the professors are, the salaries are higher, the buildings are nice. I don't know. The residence halls are a lot nicer than they used to be, but I don't know what caused everything to just go up so high.
Football coaches make more.
Yeah, that's true.
Gwen says bureaucratic bloat is part of the tuition increase.
Yeah.
Over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good question. I think again, this is all kind of turns into like a larger discussion about the state of higher education, right? It's.
No, I did work. I had to pay for a lot of mine myself, and I did a lot of work study, and that was old-fashioned work study. I did that, and you can get really easy jobs in college, like work at the library. Or, I think I did something with. I had to do something with some animals, and they're really easy jobs that you can get paid for. So that's another thing that kids can do.
Really, really great questions and great input. What else is on people's minds? We're getting up towards the end, so we probably have time for maybe one more question or one more comment if anyone wants to share. But this has been I feel like this falls into the same category as like the estate planning discussions we have, right? Where you hear from people who have gone through it or are planning for it, to hear how everybody is thinking about it so that you can come up with your own plan. That's what I find to be the most valuable parts of these types of discussions, that the way Laurie presented it, it's not like, hey, here is what you do. It's like, oh my gosh, we need to put some tools in our toolbox for how to think about this. These are some of the tools. This is how you can use it in order to develop your own plan. So I really, really appreciate that, and appreciate what everybody shared on the call, because it's just like the more you hear, the more you can feel empowered to make the right decisions for yourself and your family about these types of decisions.
Sarah, I just one other idea is to marry a European, so your kid can go to college in Europe for free or close to it. You have like a 4-year time horizon to get married, I guess, is another way to think of it. or to claim your Irish grandparents, you know, get your own EU passport. But I was also curious, I've just heard so much speculation about like whether Biden's gonna forgive all student loans or whatever. And I'm curious, you know, for those of us who hold our own student loans, I'm just curious if you have any sense at all, it's not a good enough plan for us to live by. Like, oh, by the time our kids go to college, they won't have to pay for it. But what is your sense of the political climate around that stuff?
Oh man, like I'm going to go out and say that I don't think much is going to come from it. And maybe like in like dribbles and drabs, maybe there'll be like $5,000, $10,000 forgiveness at a time. But I don't think that kind of, at least what I heard people talking about was like, oh, we're going to like forgive everything, right? Like everything goes away. I don't think there's the political willpower to do it. I don't, but certainly like, I don't know if I have any more information than anyone else does on the views of Congress, but I see it being a pretty low probability event in this case. But that doesn't mean that new programs can't be created, or that, you know, again, like maybe chunks could be forgiven over time for those who still have federal loans, right? Like certainly like private loans, like you're going to be stuck with those forever. Like nobody's going to make private lenders discharge their loans, but for people who have loans in the federal program, maybe there's some relief, but I don't think it's going to look like total forgiveness for a great big chunk of people, unfortunately, for those people, right? And I'm
Thanks, Sarah, for the pep talk at the end. I was really banking on, yeah, Elizabeth Warren's drawing up the papers right now.
Yeah, sorry. I'm getting ready for your European wedding. So that's now what I'm planning for.
Not for lack of trying, I will say.
Well, this has been so fun, everybody. It's 4:30. Thank you for coming. And we're going to post this to the AWIG YouTube channel that we have so that you can come back and look at it again or send it to your friends. This is a topic I think we cover maybe once every year or two, just because, again, it's a big financial decision that's weighing on a lot of people's minds. So hopefully this was helpful. Laurie, I found this incredibly helpful. Thank you for taking such a big topic and putting it into a manageable 2 hours for us to deal with. I think it was really, really helpful to do it that way. So thank you for all the work you put into it.
Sure, it was useful for me because I didn't really know what I was doing. And I appreciate all the input, especially the knowledge about you can use your IRA without a penalty. I didn't know that. So it does make you wonder more about the 529.
Yeah.
But yeah, I learned something.
Yeah. It's another tool in the toolbox. Well, cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Go out and enjoy the rest of the month. We'll see you again in August for a discussion on Medicare, right? So if you are nearing 65, know anyone nearing 65, just want to know about Medicare, please join us in August. That invitation will be coming out shortly.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Laurie. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. Later.
Bye.